Most people think Viking runes were magic spells, dark rituals, forbidden symbols carved by sorcerers. That's wrong. Runes were weapons, not of steel, but of meaning. They marked ownership. They shaped belief. They decided who was protected and who was cursed. And once something was carved into reality, it could not be taken back. This is the real story of Viking runes. Runes were the writing system used by the Vikings and other Germanic peoples of Northern Europe. They were not painted on paper. They were carved, cut into wood, stone, bone, and metal. That single fact shaped everything about them. Straight lines, sharp angles, no curves, because curves are difficult to carve into wood. Runes were not designed to look beautiful. They were designed to survive. They were tools made for a harsh world. The earliest and most famous runic system is known as the Elder Futhark. It consisted of 24 symbols. Each rune represented a sound, just like a letter. But unlike modern alphabets, every rune also had a name, and every name had a meaning. This is where things become interesting. One rune meant wealth or cattle. Another meant strength. Another meant journey. Another meant protection. So when a Viking carved runes into an object, he wasn't just writing sounds, he was carving meaning. Writing with runes was never neutral. Even a simple word carried symbolic weight. But here is the most important point. Runes were not magical by default. A Viking carving his name into a sword was not casting a spell. He was marking ownership. A merchant carving runes into cargo was recording information. Runes were used for messages, memorials, boundaries, and trade. They were practical, but the Vikings believed something else as well. They believed that symbols influence reality. If a rune represented strength, then carving it onto a weapon was believed to reinforce that quality. Not magic like in fantasy stories, but symbolic power, psychological power, cultural power. The Vikings lived in a world ruled by uncertainty. Storms could destroy everything. Disease could strike without warning. War was constant. They believed fate was unavoidable, but influence was possible. And runes became a way to influence fate. Protective runes were carved on doorways and homes, on ships before long voyages, on weapons carried into battle. Cursing runes were carved in secret, meant to bring misfortune to enemies. To the Viking mind, words carved into the physical world did not just describe reality. They interacted with it. In warfare, runes played a powerful role. Warriors carved symbols onto swords, spears, and shields, not for decoration, but for intent, victory, strength, fear. A blade marked with runes was believed to fight with the warrior, not just for him. And belief matters. Confidence decides battles long before steel meets steel. Runes were also deeply connected to travel. Journey runes were carved into ships, especially before dangerous sea voyages. Some inscriptions asked for protection from storms. Others recorded who built the ship or who commanded it. On long journeys across open water, runes preserved identity. They told the world, "We were here. We survived this journey. We claimed this path." But why did runes feel so magical? Because most people could not read them. Literacy was rare, and anything rare becomes powerful. If only a few people understand symbols, those symbols feel dangerous, mysterious. Runemasters held authority, not because they cast spells, but because they controlled meaning. They decided what was written, what was remembered, what was made permanent. That kind of control feels like magic in any society. Runes were also used to remember the dead. Across Scandinavia, thousands of runestones were raised along roads, near bridges, and beside settlements. They were not hidden. They were meant to be seen. These stones recorded names, family ties, journeys, and deaths. They told stories of brothers who never returned from raids, of fathers who died overseas, of sons who built ships and sailed east or west. In a world without books, runestones were memory carved into stone. To carve a name was to refuse forgetting, and forgetting to the Vikings was a second death. Runes were also deeply connected to law and order. Before written law codes, agreements were remembered through spoken words and symbols. Boundary markers were carved with runes. Ownership was marked with runes. Warnings were carved into wood or stone. A carved symbol carried authority, because it was permanent. A spoken threat could be denied. A carved rune could not. This made runes powerful tools of control, long before they were associated with magic. Some rune inscriptions were deliberately cryptic. Bind runes combined several symbols into one, not to hide spells, but to hide meaning. Only those trained could read them correctly. This allowed messages to be understood by a few, while remaining meaningless to everyone else. Knowledge became a gate, and gates create power. This is where later myths began, because when meaning is hidden, people assume magic. Runes were also used in rituals, but not in the way modern fantasy imagines. They were not shouted. They were not cast into the air. They were carved slowly, deliberately. The act of carving mattered. Time mattered. Intent mattered. To carve a rune was to commit. You could not erase it easily. You could not undo it. That permanence made the act feel dangerous, sacred. In some sagas, runes are described as misunderstood tools. Carved incorrectly, they cause harm. Used without knowledge, they bring disaster. Not because they are cursed, but because meaning, once misunderstood, can be destructive. A wrong word can start a war. A wrong symbol can change a life. That idea terrified the Vikings, and it should. Runes followed the Vikings wherever they went. They appear in Scandinavia, in England, along trade routes in Eastern Europe, and carved into objects far from home. Even when Vikings settled among other cultures, they continued to carve runes. Because runes were not just language. They were identity. They said who you were, where you came from, and who you belonged to. When Christianity spread, runes did not disappear immediately. For centuries, runic inscriptions and Latin letters existed side by side. Some Christian messages were written in runes. Some pagan symbols survived in churches. The transition was slow and symbolic, because replacing runes was not just changing letters. It was changing how people understood power. Sacred meaning moved away from carved symbols and into written scripture. Authority moved from runemasters to priests. Meaning became centralized, standardized, controlled. That was the true end of the runes. Not destruction, replacement. But even today, runes still feel different. Because modern writing is temporary, screens change, ink fades, files disappear, runes were carved to last. They demanded commitment, and in a world where belief shaped reality, that commitment felt like magic. Runes were not just letters, and they were not just magic. They were something more dangerous. They were meaning made permanent, carved into wood, carved into steel, carved into belief. And in the Viking world, belief was power.